Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Cash Flow Positive. I'm your host, Kenny Bedwell, here to talk to you today about market saturation. Hot topic, buzzword, trigger word for a lot of hosts in the industry. I feel like it's kind of the boogeyman for short term rentals. I hear it all the time. I'm not making anybody, the market's saturated, or I don't want to invest there because the market's saturated, or it's a bad market, it's saturated, or whatever. So it's always saturation is the fault. Reality is there's so many other things that can cause saturation. We'll talk about those in different episodes. But I do want to talk about the boogeyman today. And I want to break it down on this episode. I've got 15 minutes, which for some people might seem a long time, but for me, I'm like, man, that flies by pretty quickly. So I really want to break this down so that you can determine it on your own. Right when you get off this episode, you can go into STR Insights or maybe another data provider if you don't like me. And I'm just kidding. And measure saturation for yourself. Okay. So let's talk about what saturation is first. How can he define saturation? Because reality is markets aren't actually saturated. It's properties that are saturated. So what does that mean? And then we'll talk about how to actually measure it. I'll give you some examples. And as I always say, this is a part one. We're going to talk in the part two episode. I'm going to interview someone who is in a really saturated market, and they're going to share how they're actually making money in a very saturated, quote unquote, market that I am renowned for hating on. And so I'm really excited for you to listen to that episode. But let's talk about saturation. Dive into it. As always, if you are listening to this, I am going to be sharing some slides that will be available on YouTube. It's available at the STR Insights YouTube channel at STR Insights. So be sure to go on there and obviously please subscribe to that channel. It'd be great. And watch that. And we'll talk. Okay, so definition of saturation. Let's keep it very, very, very simple. So what does it mean? Because by the way, guys, oversaturation is not a term. It's just saturated. So like markets or properties are either saturated or they're not. They're not oversaturated. That's not really a thing. So don't say that. Let's talk about this. So what is saturation? So basically, if we're looking, so I've got a graph up right now. It's got a price, like a supply curve and a demand curve. We've all seen those. They look like an X, right? And price is going up. And then you've got quantity going other, basically meaning the more quantity there is, or the lower the price. So in a perfect world where the supply and the demand curve meet, that's like the equilibrium, meaning perfect scenario, right? There's perfect amount of demand and perfect amount of supply and everybody's happy. What we're seeing today across and I'm going to talk macro terms here for a second, is that there has been a shift and an increase in the amount of quantity. Okay. Which means when there's a shift in the amount of quantity and not that much shift and increase in the amount of demand, what happens, and you can actually see this illustrated here, the prices drop. And that's what happens. And that's where saturation comes from. Everyone's prices are dropping, therefore there's saturation, which this is kind of what saturation is, meaning that there's just more supply than what there was before and demand hasn't really increased that much. Now, the reality is, let's keep it real, keep it 100. Okay. The demand is ever increasing on Airbnb in every single market. Okay. It actually hasn't dropped anywhere. Maybe Blue Ridge and Broken Bow, but it's pretty much just going up every single year, believe it or not. What has gone up even more though is supply. That's why we're seeing dips in pricing in a lot of different markets. It's gotten a lot more competitive. So when you see that, you're experiencing saturation. Okay. Now I'm going to share some graphs and stuff and show you when to panic and when not to panic, but more importantly, how to measure it. So let's keep going. All right. So here's my formula. If you're listening, try to write this down if you can, but I'm going to try to make it as black and white as possible. So here's how you determine saturation. Now, from a high level, you take the RevPAR, which stands for revenue per active rental, from a month of last year, and you compare it to the RevPAR, so the revenue per active listing of a month from this year, and you divide those two numbers together. Okay, so let's break it down a little bit easier. So let's take February 2023, the revenue, the total revenue. So how's RevPAR calculated? We take the total revenue of a given month. So February 2023 is revenue. And we divide it by the total number of active short-term rental listings in that market. And that will give us a number. Okay. Then we take the same numbers, but from 2024 of February. So the total revenue of all short-term rentals of February 2024 and divide that by the total active listing count. Okay, so that gives us one number. So we have two numbers, usually in the thousands. It could be like 43, 42, whatever it is. We take those two numbers and we divide the 2023 numbers over 2024. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, re-listen to this and definitely go watch the video on YouTube because it's pretty clear on here. So if that number, so if you divide 2023 divided by 2024 numbers, if that number is less than one, your market is not saturated. Okay. If it is greater than one, then it is saturated. But here's the thing: saturation is not, and I'm going to say this over and over and over, it's not on a market level. So although you can do the exercise I just told you to do for the entire market, it's actually not right because demand varies based on bedroom count. So that means that there's different supply and demand charts for every single bedroom count. So saturation is never on a market level, it's on a bedroom count level. And I'm going to prove this to you with a very saturated quote unquote market and show you where the bedroom counts are not certain bedroom counts are not saturated. So what I mean by this is that if you look at a market and there's thousands of 2 and 3 and 4 bedroom properties, but there's only 2 7-bedroom properties, do you think the 7-bedroom properties are hurting for business? Probably not, because who is booking 7 bedrooms? It's groups of people. It's not a family or 2 families. It's groups of people. So that supply and demand chart economics is going to be different than the economics and the supply and demand for 1, 2s, and 3s, and even 4s and 5s. So when we look at the differences, that's where we can find opportunity. I talked about finding sweet spots, and bedroom counts is one of them. And this is part of it because you will find in heavily saturated markets, there I go saying markets again, you'll find in markets where everyone says they're saturated, certain bedroom counts, there's a ton of demand for and not enough supply. And that's where you look for opportunity. So don't let the boogeyman of saturation scare you away from a particular market. You just need to know what to look for. Okay. So remember, it's on a property level. So when I'm doing all the formula I just taught you, I'm doing it based on a bedroom count. So the total revenue for bedroom count divided by the total number of active short-term rentals for that particular bedroom count. So saturation can fluctuate. This is important too. Supply and demand changes. It's never the same. So just because a property count is saturated today doesn't mean it's going to be saturated 6 months from now. Or just because it's not saturated today doesn't mean it's not going to be saturated in the future. If we're looking to acquire properties, we have to look for properties that have what I call a moat, meaning something that separates us from everybody else. Okay. This could be certain amenities. This could be our design and decor. This could be certain unique aspects about the particular property, but it needs to have a moat. It needs to be unique. When I teach people and I find deals for clients, they ask me all the time about saturation because naturally it's the boogeyman, right? Well, are we looking at a saturated market, Kenny? And my response to that is, I don't know, because I'm not focused on saturation. I'm focused on finding properties that have that moat, that have that curb appeal, that are those scroll stoppers, those ones people have to stay at because that's why they're going to that market. The demand isn't going anywhere. And in fact, it's ever increasing in 99% of markets. So if that's the case, why are we worried about being saturated? You know what I mean? Like, the people who should be concerned are the people who bought cookie cutter properties and cookie cutter neighborhoods. We know those exist. If you look at Branson, you look at the Smokies, Blue Ridge, where they're building subdivisions of properties that look exactly the same. Everybody knows those suck. Don't buy those. Okay. That's the easy button. That's the easy way out. And you'll find that those don't cash flow. The whole point of listening to this is the cash flow. So we're looking for properties that are unique, whether they could be unique houses, unique bedroom counts, location, proximity, amenities, design and decor, all those great, fabulous things. What separates you from everybody else? And we also want to think about this from a long-term perspective, meaning that in 5 years from now, can somebody come along and replicate what you have? And if they can, what are you going to do to beat them? Okay. A lot of people think that they could just go in and I think of the Smokies as a perfect example of this. And you'll hear me pick on the Smokies a lot. And it's not that it's a bad market. It's just a very, very competitive market. extremely competitive, one of the most competitive because there's thousands of short-term rentals, a ton of demand, but thousands of short-term rentals. And they're competing, and everybody has to be on their A game in order to be the best. And it's extremely hard. And I will personally never invest there. And the reason why is because it's so dang competitive. Okay. I'm not looking to jump into that. It's hard to create a moat when everybody is competitive. Everyone's putting in pools in the cabins. Okay. That wasn't a thing like 3 years ago. Now it is. Now everybody has it. Okay. Now we're going to get like pools, rooftop pools that are heated and all like it never ends. And so what can we do to separate ourselves? In my market, no one had a hot tub. I'm the first one with a hot tub in a lake market. How insane is that? Right? So when we're identifying markets and looking for places to invest, like which one do you want to be in? The ones where they're thinking about rooftop hot tubs or no one has a hot tub. So think about this before you even get into a market. But if you're listening to this, you're already in a very competitive market. Think about what more you can do. What's that moat? Think about the moat. Okay, let's keep moving on. Let's actually move to an example of calculating saturation. So I have another chart here I'm showing. It's RevPAR, which remember RevPAR stands for revenue per active rental. Okay, and this is a bedroom count. This is actually one of my markets. And basically, RevPAR goes up and down. It changes because supply and demand can change throughout the year. And it's important to know that saturation fluctuates. Okay, but that's why we still want to compare saturation on seasons as well, not just, oh, well, it says this market or this property count is saturated, therefore I shouldn't invest here. We should compare the different seasons over time. All right, so let's take a look at an actual example. So the example here, I have Orlando, Florida, which is considered to be one of the most saturated markets. Now, for those listening that are in Orlando and know Orlando, Orlando actually has really, really, really strict regulations. And it's more like Kissimmee and Davenport that are the more popular vacation markets that people have short-term rentals in. But I group them all together and put them into a bucket called Orlando. So for other people who don't know Orlando well, it's the Orlando market and we'll leave it as that. But we know that Disney World, Universal, SeaWorld, all the other great major parks are all there, big popular, thousands, tens of thousands of short-term rentals, okay? Definition, the boogeyman, all throughout there. But let's take a look at 4 bedrooms in Orlando. So if you see February 2023, there were about 2,400 short-term rentals. And in February 2024, we saw an increase. There's about 2,800. Oh, that's scary. 400 more short-term rentals. Okay. Well, what was the total revenue in February 2023 for those same short-term rentals? It was about 10 million. Okay. I'm making this easier for those listening because there's actual numbers here. And then in 2024, it was 11 million. Okay. So the actual revenue went up, but so did the supply. So what's our number? Okay. Well, if we take the RevPAR of 2023 and divide that by the RevPAR of 2024, like I talked about earlier, that gives us about a 1.019% saturation, meaning that if you take off the 1, you're left with 0.19, which is about 1.9% saturated, which really isn't that bad. It's about 2% saturated, right? That's really not terrible. Okay, so saturation, when you actually calculate it, isn't necessarily the end of the world. It just means it's like your supply and demand curve is almost at equilibrium if it's slightly saturated. So if I see saturation between a 0 to 5% range, I'm not really concerned about it. That's pretty standard. And it can actually fluctuate from saturated to not saturated. Okay. If I run the same thing for 2 and 3 bedrooms, the saturation level goes up from like 2% to like 10, 15%. Now I'm like kind of in a yikes mode, right? So anything between, so my rule of thumb is 0 to 5% saturated, no concern at all. 6 to 10%, I'm a little concerned about saturation of that particular bedroom count. 10 to 20%, yikes, we're pretty saturated. And, I either need to really consider adding something or I don't need to look in that market if I'm looking to purchase. And then finally, if a market is over 20%, like some of the markets I'm going to call out in a second, you need to avoid them. Avoid them like the plague, okay? And I know that's going to tick off a lot of people, especially realtors listening who have properties in these markets. But the reality is a lot of people that are listening to this and taking advice from me are first-time investors, okay? And I'm speaking to the average. So that's really, really, really important. And know that I don't mean to personally attack anyone when I call out certain markets, but I don't want people calling me saying, hey, I invested in a market and I'm losing money. That's not my goal. It's to help you make money. So I want to point you in the right directions. So I am going to call out some markets here. And like I said, I don't mean any offense to these, but these are just by the data, by the way we calculate RevPAR and everything and saturation. These are quote unquote saturated markets. Broken Bow, Blue Ridge, Davenport, Lake Tahoe, Joshua Tree, Myrtle Beach. I can literally keep going on. I'm just going to list 6 here because I'm going to get a bunch of death threats after this from realtors. But the reality is these are very, very, very competitive markets and they're technically saturated right now. And you have to be careful. Certain bed, and when I say saturated, also something too that's in the slide here, it's just across all the bedroom counts that's saturated, not just the lower bedroom counts, not just the higher ones, so all bedroom counts. It's 10+% saturation. So these markets are not only like, yikes, but I would just avoid them altogether if I was looking to purchase. If you're currently in them, I'm not saying you need to sell, but you need to get creative. And that's why in the next episode, I've got someone awesome coming in, and she's actually in one of these very, very, very saturated markets. And she's going to tell you how she's actually making money in these markets, doing really, really well. It was a shocker to me, especially with the market she was in. And I want you guys to pay attention to her story and hear what she's doing, because there are some amazing takeaways that you can walk away with and apply to your own properties or future properties. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Cash Flow Positive. My name is Kenny Bedwell, and I will see you on the next episode in part 2, where we go over how to beat saturation in any market.